Hello, friends. You should have a social studies document open. This is your third assignment since you've been starting to study the American Revolutionary War. Um, and your learning target here. You can describe how the government worked in England and in America, although it wasn't called the United States of America yet. It was 13 colonies. You're going to describe the causes and effects of taxes in the 1760s. You're on page 16 to 19. Hopefully you have a literal copy of this book, George versus George, right now to use. Um, anyways, the focusing question, how did some colonists react to the new taxes? So the people who live in the 13 colonies, how do they react when England says, hey, you got to pay more taxes? And I want to know what your opinion of this is. So hopefully you went through and answered these questions. Is it better to have a king and a queen? Or is it better to have people who are elected into the government? Elected meaning they get voted in by people. And the question is, what do you know about taxes? Hopefully you've brainstormed this and talked about it. And here's this map. After the French and Indian War, how did things change? Hint, hint, land. Who gained land? Who lost land? Okay, so for right now, you're reading these page 16 and 17, and you're going to see who had all the power in the government in England, and one way the government in England and America, one way they were different. And you're going to think about how it either kind of blocks or challenges human rights. I have the book on a dock right here, so I'm going to zoom on in and read this. So it tells us right here, the British government was a constitutional monarchy, which was a fancy way of saying that King George did not have all the power. So the king didn't have all the power. He and a governing body called Parliament worked together to rule the empire. So Parliament are basically the lawmakers. They make laws and they also decide to get how money is spent. Young King George tried hard with much success to see that Parliament's decisions agreed with his point of view. Even so, he had some very strong opponents, and it was Parliament that made laws and controlled the purse strings, meaning they controlled the dinero. Okay? So when you're looking at this picture, you can see at the very top, King George and Parliament. That symbolizes the people who are making laws and spending money. Now, Parliament was split. You can see it's split into two parts, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. This House of Lords was made up of noblemen who inherited the right. They were born rich. Their parents might have been part of this House of Lords, so they got to. So they didn't earn it, they were just given this title. The House of Commons were people who were elected, so they got voted in by people. But then it says sometimes they were the sons of noblemen, often rigged their own elections, and they bought their seats. So the House of Commons, they weren't all common people. Some people kind of rigged the election. And voters, it says fewer than 1 in 5 men were allowed to vote in England. And these men usually had to own their own land or business for the privilege. No women, nothing else. Men, only 1 in 5 men, and you basically had to be rich to be able to vote. So they would probably vote for people who are going to help them and not help others. So these rich people are probably going to vote for people who are going to help them. So this is how government worked in England. So this is in the 1700s. Now, the next part, across the ocean in the colonies, they're saying America is the 13 colonies, not United States of America yet. The 13 American colonies were not yet united into a single country. Each separate colony was under the crown's control, meaning they were part of England, and each had its own governor and a governing body that made laws and imposed taxes. Some people who served in the government were elected by colonists. For example, George Washington was an elected member of the Virginia House of Burgesses, the lower house. For years, England had looked the other way when colonists ignored British laws they didn't like. So basically, in America, they still have the king and parliament were still in charge. But all of the 13 colonies had their own governors who were in charge of the colonies. No, you notice all males, all white males. Okay, each colony has its own governor. All but 2 were appointed by the crown to serve as the British chief's representatives. Their job was to enforce British laws and carry out British orders. So all of these people were appointed, meaning they did not get voted in. The king or parliament picked them. Now think about who they want to pick. They want to pick people who are probably going to agree with them always. These 13 colonies, they all had their little governing bodies, meaning they all had a group of people who would make laws and send them to England for approval. And most of them had 2 houses. an upper house and a lower house. In the upper house, the king or representatives pick the members, and then all members of the lower house were white male colonists, and most were rich, they were wealthy. Their job was to carry out British laws and levy taxes to pay for public expenses in each colony. The only voters were white male colonial landowners aged 21 or older. So they had to be 20 or older, they had to be male, they had to be white, and they had to own land. So they basically had to be wealthy. So this is what the government was like back then. So on your doc, you're going to be typing in who had all the power in the government in England. It might not be one person, it could be a combination. How was government different slightly in America than in England? And then think back to the UDHR nowadays. What human rights are not being upheld? What human rights are being challenged in this? Okay. There's going to be another screencast in a minute to watch, but this concludes this part about how government worked in England and America.